Hello everyone and a big welcome to RJ Sanderson TV Season 3, Roy. Can you believe it? We're back for another year in 2022 and we've got another massive show coming up. There's lots to dissect since we were last here. And Roy Sanderson, as always, is along for the ride. Roy, welcome.
Thanks, Dave.
There seems to be a big smile on your face and I think it's got to do with the footy. The Blues are 2-0, another big win against the Dogs last night. You must be on cloud nine at the moment.
Yep, certainly doing well. Walking tall as a Carlton supporter. I think everybody's feeling pretty pleased with themselves. It's been a long time.
Now, is the lid officially off, Roy?
There is no lid, Dave. Forget the lid. Book your tickets. No, I'm just joking. It's only 2 games in. You never know what's going to happen. But I think Carlton supporters would say it's a different team.
On top of the table, and it feels like life is good. More broadly, Roy, you've got a really good pulse, sense of the pulse of the business community and the broader community financially. Since we were last here, back in sort of November 2021, how do you think the economy's placed and how do you think businesses and individuals are placed?
I think it's a tough time right at the moment. I think we've got inflationary pressures that we'll go through soon, wage growth, the impact of Ukraine and Russia conflict. There's certainly a lot happening to dissect.
General mood, if you had to sum it up in a word, do you think?
I think generally people are feeling pretty good, but not as buoyant as we were maybe 3 years ago before COVID.
Let's get into our news headlines where we look at some of those numbers behind the sentiment. And we start today with the inflation rate. It's something that we've spoken about on this show a lot, Roy, and it was only a matter of time with that much money circulating in the economy that there was going to be pressure on inflation, and we've started to see that manifest now. 3.5% the last quarter number, which was above expectations.
And I think the feeling on the street is that with food prices going up, that 3.5% is quite low. I know it's high compared to previously, but I think we'll be looking back on this later in the year and we will realise that 3.5% is not too bad, because I think that's going to increase considerably over the next 12 months.
Commentary suggesting that fuel prices were feeling that as well as global supply chain issues, as in terms of what is creating that upward pressure on inflation. But something that is also no doubt creating upward pressure on inflation is the amount of money that is circulating in the economy, fueled by plenty of government stimulus that's been there over the past few years. And the household savings rate, as we'll see here, has been sort of has changed at various stages. It increases in the winter periods, Roy, because they coincide with lockdowns where people not only had no inclination to go outside because it's cold and wet and etc., but also they were forced to stay inside. So generally people save more money because they weren't able to spend it.
Yeah, we said on this show that it's critical that people get out and spend money because that's what's needed in the economy. And as that savings rate comes down, that means that people are spending more money, which is fueling the economy, which is fueling the inflation rate. So it's interesting how a lot of these graphs go hand in hand.
Yeah, as you say, there's a perfectly inverse relationship there between household savings and spending. So when household saving decreases, spending increases, pushes prices up and creates that inflationary pressure. As a result, we know that it's the Reserve Bank of Australia's job to monitor monetary policy, and the way they do that is through the cash rate. And Roy, I actually am a little bit surprised that we're sitting here saying no change between last show and this show, but it just feels like it feels like interest rates are on the precipice, and that an upwards movement on them is almost imminent.
The Reserve Bank have stated publicly that they want the inflation rate within a certain band. We're about to go outside that band, and I'm expecting interest rates to go up fairly soon, and maybe more than once in 2022.
Yeah, I think that having a look at the Governor's report, it suggests that the reason they didn't put interest rates up at the moment is because they're not 100% convinced on that inflation rate number. They're sort of citing that perhaps there's some anomalies that are driving that rate, things like fuel prices and supply chain issues. But if that rate does prove to be a correct representation of the basket of goods over time, then definitely they will raise interest rates. And that's exactly what they've done in the US, where the Federal Reserve there has increased interest rates. And you can see there, after a prolonged period of low interest rates, they did increase it by 0.25% or 25 basis points. And inflation in the US is a bigger problem than it is here, Roy.
And I think we're just following their lead. And I think the Reserve Bank will increase interest rates fairly soon, because it would be unusual for the US to do so. Whether they're going up or down, we would generally follow their lead.
Wages is another graph that I wanted to have a look at, because we can see that wage growth is starting to increase again after a bit of a decline in 2020. Where it's back up to 2.3%. So it's good news in one sense, but bad news for workers in the sense that it still trails behind that inflation rate of 3.5%. So no real gain there for in real value of wages, but encouragingly for workers, it is back up at 2.3%. What do you make of it, Roy?
We've had very low wages growth for a number of years because we've had taxation rates coming down. But the reality is, if we have inflationary pressures, then we have to have wages growth. It's just, they go hand in hand. So that's another factor that I'm expecting in 2022, wages growth will increase more this year.
And job advertisements at record highs. So you'd suggest that to actually limit the number of advertisements that are going to be placed in the future, you have to provide an incentive, because job advertisements, a high level of job advertisement suggest a low level of adoption of said job advertisements. So, if there's no market interest in a job at a particular price, one way to create an incentive for people to take that job is to increase the amount that you're going to pay that person. So that could, as you kind of mentioned, increase the level of wage growth.
Yes, and there is a labour shortage out there, and we're not just talking about hospitality, because we don't have many overseas travellers coming in to fill those spots. We're talking about all industries, certainly the construction industry, the accounting industry. There's labour shortages right across the board at the moment, which again is pushing up the inflationary factors and pushing up labour rates. So that's, again, they're going hand in hand.
One graph that we look at every time on this show, Roy, it's one of our favourites, is the consumer confidence graph. And you can see that it's been in decline, and it's a considerable trend now. It's sort of trending all the way back to November 2021. And it was a very steady decrease, decreasing 4.2% month on month to 96.6%. And, it's pretty obvious the factors that are affecting this. The war in Ukraine, the floods in Queensland and northern New South Wales, and it's the weakest consumer confidence index since September 2020. So, you can sort of see that this number probably increases and decreases reasonably gradually as people adapt to the news. Is there anything in particular that stands out to you there, Roy?
Yeah, I think it's probably lower than I expected, and I think the impact of the conflict, Russia-Ukraine, has had a big part to play on that. So hopefully that will turn around a little bit. I would expect it will.
When in the past we've broken down what creates changes in that consumer confidence index, and it's generally about things like people's outlook for the next 12 months on purchases, people's outlook on the economy for 12 months, and people's outlook on the economy for 5 years. And you can kind of understand that now. If you're looking at the next 12 months, are you racing in to make big purchases? Probably not, unless you're a big risk taker. There's a bit of uncertainty with what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on, with elections as well that are coming up. You sort of, holding your horses. Businesses, on the other hand, they can adapt and change more quickly than consumers, and you see the variation in the business confidence index, is much quicker than the consumer confidence index, where there's more gradual trends.
This is interesting in that it doesn't follow the consumer confidence index, isn't it?
Well, I must add that this is the February number. So next month on RJ Sanderson TV, we will have the March number, which will incorporate the war in Ukraine and some of those floods more than that February number has. So I think that's one's a watch this space. But one thing that is interesting, it's at 13, it's quite high at the moment. But you wouldn't be surprised if next month there was a massive downturn, because businesses can react and change their confidence far quicker than consumers do.
Yes, agreed. It'll be interesting to see what happens next month.
The GDP growth rate from quarter 2 2021-22 fiscal year shows that, good news, Roy, Australia's not in recession after a downturn in quarter 1, a massive upturn in quarter 2. 3.4% was the growth number, which was above expectations, and driven by a sharp rebound in household spending, which, this circular economy thing, Roy, that we're talking about a lot, goes back to that household savings number that we saw decrease. Where's it going? It's going back into the economy and it's driving growth. Yeah,
people are spending money, which is causing GDP to go up, and I think the government would be certainly very happy with those sorts of numbers as they lead into election.
And you think about JobKeeper and JobSeeker, and we've spoken about them a lot on this show, but that's all part of that premise of injecting more money into the economy. The worst case scenario was that people just saved that money, which they did for long periods of time, and we saw negative growth, which is absolutely not good for the economy. But eventually, once lockdowns ended, people started going to the restaurants. I know Roy started going to the footy again, and now after the matches, considering the results, he's spending a bit more after the game as well, and a nice bottle of red. So that's that circular motion of the economy. The government's intention of trying to get the economy going again is working through the policy that they implemented with JobKeeper, etc. And then one last graph to finish us off in this part of it, Roy, is the CoreLogic housing data. Now, there's a lot of numbers on that page. I don't expect anyone to go through that quickly. But just have a look at the distribution of green numbers, the increased numbers, and the red numbers, the decreased numbers. It's a sea of green mainly, but one intriguing number, a month-on-month decrease in the Sydney prices. By a decrease of 0.1%. So the question, I think, then becomes, is there a slight weakening of the market coming up?
I think that slide shows that there's a softening of the market, and we often get asked, is now a good time to invest in property? It's always a good time to invest in property, because when the property market drops, it drops by minor amounts. 0.1% was Sydney, 0.1. So if you're thinking about property, don't sit on the fence for too long. Make the decision and get in as soon as you can.
Those are the economic indicators, and as always, they paint a very interesting picture. And there's a very interesting predicament that confronts one man and the rest of his party, and that man is Josh Frydenberg. Oh, we've gone early on the question time, Sigga. The pressure will come for Roy. Don't you worry about that. That pressure will come for you. But perhaps I'll ask you a question about Josh Frydenberg before we get to that, Roy, because the budget is on Tuesday, the 29th of March, and it is a very interesting predicament that he finds himself in. There's an election that we think is coming up in May. The budget is in deficit. The economy is sort of, on the precipice of going either, back into boom, or potentially, further concerns around Ukraine and COVID still lingering around. It's probably a task that no one envies, Roy.
True, and we know that Josh listens to this show, so it's a delicate transaction for Josh Frydenberg this year, because generally a budget in an election year is about spending money. But because we've spent so much money on JobKeeper and JobSeeker and lots of grants and giveaways, when we needed it, we've borrowed a lot of money. So if the budget is what is normally the same as what normally happens in an election year, then that could have the reverse effect. Mostly, they spend a lot of money, but the public may look at that and say, that's irresponsible. You should not be spending that amount of money. So it's a fine line for Josh Frydenberg this year.
So you know that he's watching. What are you going to say to Josh ahead of the budget? What's your advice to Josh?
I would say don't buy votes like often election budgets are. Don't buy votes. Be very responsible about where the money is being spent.
And in terms of him coming on the show, I'm sure that he's an apology this week, but perhaps maybe in a month or two.
Yeah, we'll keep inviting you, Josh. We look forward to you joining us soon.
Just quickly on the budget before we move on there, Roy, a few things on the agenda. The fuel excise, we think that potentially there might be some changes there. For those that are wondering, how is fuel tax? It's a flat rate, 42 cents on every litre is fuel excise, so potentially the government might look to provide some relief there by lowering that amount. Aged care is obviously on the agenda, childcare subsidies, and then one-off tax offsets. They're very appealing policies for politicians because everyone gets a little, nice big lump sum in their tax return. Anything in particular that you think you might see there, Roy?
Yeah, I think the $1,080 tax offset that was temporary will become permanent. It'll become part of our tax scales, and I think that will be a good thing.
Tuesday, the 29th of March, next Tuesday, it's the budget. Strap yourself in. I know I always like to sit down and watch that one. I'm sure you're the same, Roy.
We are the same, and we do actually have a webinar on the Wednesday at 11 a.m, so grab a coffee or an early morning tea of some sort. Join us for about an hour and we'll talk through the budget, only the critical items, how it affects you and what opportunities there are.
Always so important that because it's a very dense document, the budget, and there's a whole heap of spin that goes into the creation of the talking points. So, Roy, you and your team are going to cut through it and work out what's really relevant to people. So, how do they find out about it? Just
go to our website at rjsanderson.com.au and just click on the events tab and register. It's a free event, so it should be good. We look forward to it.
We're going to speak to Leah Calnan and Katrina Poolbrook later in the show to ask them the hard questions. But, Roy, it's time to ask you the hard question on Question Time. We went early with the stinger, but we're going to go again with it. And the question today is an interesting one that has come through. It says, I've just got a new job and I need to get a police check and a working with children check. Are they tax deductible? We know that there's a cost that is associated with them. Are they tax deductible?
You would think the answer is yes, but those costs are incurred before you have got the job. You've actually got to supply those to your new employer. So they're not tax deductible because they've been incurred prior to getting a job. A little bit like education that doesn't relate to your current work, it's between jobs. But if you've incurred those costs while you're working at a particular employer and they need a renewal or an update, say 3 yearly, then that cost is a tax deduction. But if it's for a new job, it's not a tax deduction.
Geez, it's a bit stiff, isn't it? I think the message there is that if that happens, make sure you take your receipt to your employer if you get the job and say, hey, maybe time for reimbursement. Roy, there's a bit going on in the tax space. You've got a few updates that you want to go through. What in particular have you got for us today?
Yes, well, there's this business full expensing provision which was brought in and was due to expire on the 30th of June 2022. It has been extended an extra 12 months, but it's very crucial that it's based on delivery. So if you go out and order a new vehicle for your business and delivery doesn't happen until July, then you only get to claim that tax deduction in the next tax return, not the 30th of June 2022 tax return. Superannuation on wages. There is currently today a $450 monthly threshold that you don't have to pay super on. So if the staff member earns less than $450 per month, super's not relevant or not paid, but that's changing from the 1st of July. You pay super on every dollar paid. We know that the company tax rate is decreasing to 25%, and I mentioned already our the budget and our analysis webinar, which you'll get from our website.
Plenty going on in that space, and also some changes to the way that trust distributions, I should say, are taxed. What have you got for us here, Roy?
Yes, you could probably read through that slide, but this is a tax alert that's just been issued. It affects discretionary trusts. Basically, in a nutshell, it says that if you have a family trust and you distribute to children, adult children, you must ensure that the money flows and that the purpose of that distribution is not just to save tax. So $20,000, just a little over $20,000 is tax-free to anybody over 18. So make sure that the distribution is, the physical money is flowing to the children. And the tax office have issued an alert saying that they can go backwards in time to review. I'm not sure they will, but they can. I would make sure that your 2022 tax distribution minutes and reasons and purposes are clearly spelled out in a minute and a document, and I'd be talking to your accountant this year if you run a trust or discretionary trust.
There you go. I think the message to me there is very clear. Go and seek advice if you think that you don't fully understand that, because it is complicated and distributions from trusts are inherently complicated. So rjsanderson.com.au for more info. Right, strap yourself in. This is the time that we all just sort of sit near Roy and hope that he doesn't explode too much, because it's time for Roy's Rage. And Roy, you've had 3 or 4 months now to sort of build up that frustration. What's got you fired up today?
Well, this is a state tax in Victoria. Now, I know this show goes Australia-wide, and some people in other states of Australia are going to hear this and wonder if I'm telling the truth. There's a new tax that's being invented. It was to come in on the 1st of July this year, and it's just been delayed till the 1st of July next year. It's called a windfall gains tax. And what it says is if you have a property, and this will relate to farmers and people in the country, if you have a property that's rezoned and the value of the property increases in value, and that you can tell that from the council rates valuation, if it goes up by up to $100,000, that's fine, it's tax-free. But the gain between $100,000 and $500,000 is taxed at 62.5%. Do you believe that? 62.5%, and any gain over $500,000 is taxed at 50%. So this is a new state government tax based on council valuations and affects any property that is rezoned from one zone to another. So I think we as Victorians need to put our hand up. It's a state election this year and we need to get this cancelled. This is a new tax that I think is unfair, because farmers or developers are going to be hit very big, and I don't think it's necessary. They're the people who took the risk when they purchased a block of land or a parcel of land, and they're the ones that should get the gain, not give it to the state government.
The counter argument to that, and I mean, I see your frustration there. The counter argument to that is if a giant property gets rezoned and there's potentially, and Roy, I know you're a climatarian at heart. You drive the Tesla. There's potentially massive implications for the environment, which has fiscal implications. If you subdivide a giant farm into new housing developments, there's some costs, and it's not just economic costs, there's an environmental cost. Do you see any merit through that lens?
I don't believe any of the money is going to go to environmental or climate change. The money is just going to go into the coffers of the state government. So I don't see any benefits for that tax whatsoever.
All right, that's got you fired up. But I as I said off the top, you can't wipe the smile off Roy's face at 2 and zip with the Blues. And something absolutely shocking has happened today. I came in here, I looked at the rundown, and I just had to change my glasses because it says Roy's shout out. What on earth is this?
Well, this is an example of where you should congratulate somebody, and I've just given a whack to the state government of Victoria, but I'm actually going to give them a pat on the back. They invented a new tax. They announced it. They said it was coming in on the 1st of July this year. It was called a property developers tax on any development over 3 units. There was going to be a tax at 1.75%, which was going to drive up house prices. And after the industry, the public got on board and said, this is a terrible tax, they got rid of it. So fantastic. Well done. They realised it was a bad tax. They need to do the same with the windfall gains tax. So a pat on the back for getting rid of this tax. You just deserve another. You need to think a little wider and also get rid of that windfall gains tax as well.
Wow. So a big slap for the Victorian government, then a pat on the back. It's like a footy club, you get the dressing down, but then the camaraderie after. So mixed emotions for the Victorian government from Roy. On the topic of houses and the real estate market, it's a great pleasure to welcome a good friend of RJ Sanderson TV, Leah Kalnin, who's the president of the Real Estate Institute of Victoria. Leah, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to RJ Sanderson TV.
Thank you for having me.
Leah, we're perpetually hearing stories about the housing market is finally ready to, or the bubble's ready to burst and prices are going to fall off a cliff. And I remember we heard about it at the start of COVID as well, and a very bleak outlook. What's your perspective as the president of the REIV?
Well, really, what we've seen over the last quarter, and when we talk about the last quarter, it's really leading into that December figures. We're still seeing consistent trending upwards. So it was around that, between that 2 and 4% increase. But keeping in mind with the March quarter figures, which will come out somewhere around that middle of April Easter period, we still have 6,000 properties to go to auction in the lead up to Easter. So we should still see those consistent numbers, and we should still see some level of growth in both the housing, the houses, the units, and probably the regional area as well.
Leah, CoreLogic reporting a soft month-on-month increase for Melbourne capital city prices overall. What did you make of that? Does that indicate a running out of steam at all?
Oh, look, I think there's a couple of factors that we still haven't really taken into consideration. Two would be the immigration and migration component. We've now started to open our borders. So we've only been selling really to Australians for the last 2 years. So we will see some influx coming through there. The other consideration is there's a lot of talk with regards to interest rates, potentially being increased probably middle of the year. But again, we probably need to put that into perspective. We are almost at zero interest rates. So if there is an increase in interest rates, it's probably not going to be too substantial. And then the third part that is probably a little bit more interesting for 2022 is you're competing with a state election coming up and a federal election coming up. So there's a few different factors coming in at the moment.
Leah, given the property market is continuing to increase by, what you said, 2 to 4%, what are the suburbs we should be buying in, and what has done the best so far?
Look, across most areas of Melbourne and even into those regional Victoria towns, there seems to be good consistency across many. So in a strong market where it's very hard to predict, and I think you guys have got a slide, you'll actually be able to see there is some good suburb performance happening. But that's not to say that those suburbs won't have that same level of performance, say in the next quarter. We are certainly seeing an increase in the number of suburbs becoming those $1 million suburbs. So it's a particular one to watch. And if you think about, I've said this before with regards to bridesmaid suburbs, if there is a particular suburb that you're focused on and wanting to be on, maybe go a suburb or two prior to that particular area, and you actually might get in at a more reasonable price, but you will then see those values continue to spread out further.
Leah, you mentioned a couple of elections this year in Victoria particularly. How does that kind of affect particularly investors? What are some of the signs they should be looking out for in the budgets that are going to be delivered, federally next week, and then the state budget coming up later in the year? You mentioned, these new and improving suburbs. What are some of the sort of budgetary measures that investors should be looking out for?
So it's going to be, I think affordability is certainly going to be a really hot topic, and where people are going to be able to afford to live. I think COVID's changed the way people look to buy property. No longer would we say, I've grown up in a particular area with, in my family home, and that's the area that I particularly want to live in. So there is definitely now, with that hybrid approach to work, there is more opportunity for people to potentially buy in a regional area, but potentially rent in a, suburban or in a city area of Melbourne. But yeah, affordability, number one. And I think from the investor point of view, how are they going to support investors? Because really, investors, particularly both commercial and resi investors, they've absolutely taken a hit in the last, 2 years. There's been a lot of stimulus provided, but the average investor owns one property. I think the stat is somewhere around 72%. And most of those investors were never given any land tax relief. So it will be interesting to see what support they get. Because what is really important at the moment is that there is a rental, crisis brewing, and there is going to be a high number of people looking for rental accommodation, and there'll be a really challenged supply aspect. So the investors in our private rental sector are extremely important for our housing market, not just Victoria, but across the entire country.
And I think just to elaborate on that point, Leah, like I think there's a lot of people that don't realise the flow-on effect of that. If there's no supply of rental, housing for as an example, migrant workers, then it has a flow-on effect into the skill shortages and into other industries. So it is really important that the government considers the investment or investors in their budget. And you sort of mentioned that they've kind of been left behind a little bit over the last 2 years. What are some of the particular measures that you guys will be proposing to government?
Look, it's something that we're just starting to work on. There will be some advocacy in those particular spaces, but there has to be some consideration potentially of some tax relief. If we look about the Victorian market, I think the Andrews government's implemented around 2021 additional taxes to the property market as a whole since they've been in government. I get the fact that people own property and can contribute. However, they are providing housing. And when we look at the overall numbers across the state of Victoria, government only provide 3.5% of the supply to the social and the community housing. So there is an enormous amount of pressure on the private rental market. So at the same time, you've got this balance between morally wanting to do the right things and support people and provide housing, but they also have the financial challenges around increased council rates, increased land tax. So in return, what we're then going to see is increase in rents. And they're not going to be these, $5 and $10 a week rent increases that we've seen in the past. They're potentially in some areas going to be $20, $30, $50 a week rent increases.
Leah, given rent increases will be adding to the inflationary pressures in Australia, I'm curious what the vacancy rates are like. If we've got a rental market increasing value in pricing, then a vacancy rate must be coming down. Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, they're certainly trending down. In the midst of COVID, we were sitting somewhere between 8 and I think 9% in the city, so within say 5Ks of CBD Melbourne, and regional still. If you think about Ballarat, I think they were still sitting at that 1%. So, and in anything under 3% is deemed critical. So what we're now starting to see, and I've seen it with some clients myself, in the midst of COVID, they had an inner city apartment and they potentially took a rent reduction of $150, $200 a week rent reduction. So now that we're coming out and we're seeing the rental market strengthening, those owners are now going, well, I can only increase the rent every 12 months because that's a new part of legislation that came in last year. So I can't do those smaller increases. I need to do those larger increases to be able to climb my way back to actually what market conditions are.
It's a fascinating jigsaw, and I know that the REIV, Leah, are going to play a big part in that, particularly later on in the year. Thanks so much, as always, for your time on RJ Sanderson TV. We really appreciate you jumping on the show.
My pleasure, guys, anytime.
Thank you, Leah.
Leah Calnan, the president of the Real Estate Institute of Victoria. And Roy, as Leah mentioned, there's many considerations for governments federally and at a state and local base to consider, moving forward. Yeah,
you mentioned the word jigsaw, and I think that's an apt description. And I will say, thanks to Leah, the REIV are very lucky to have such a talented superstar at the top of their organisation. So well done to Leah.
And a good friend of RJ Sanderson TV. Roy, the stock market is it's been an interesting beast. Since we last left, we were sort of back at record highs, and then there was some uncertainty over the break, over the summer. And now we're starting to see, I think, a little bit of a recovery, but, who better to check in with than Katrina Poolbrook, Executive Planner with RJS. Katrina, welcome to RJ Sanderson TV.
Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Katrina, the stock market at the moment, there's been a bit of volatility, and we know that there's some reactions to the war in Ukraine. Tell us about what investors need to be vigilant about at the moment, given the uncertainty in the market.
That's a very good question. One of the key things that we always need to worry about and to mitigate is to make sure that we have enough cash on hand. Cash is the only way that you can ensure your investments. So if you've been fully invested over the last few years because returns have been spectacular, you need to take stock now and think we need to hold cash. Not just personally, a lot of the fund managers are now storing cash for a different reason. They're looking at opportunities in the market because the market's more volatile at the moment. The other thing that we also need to have a look is to understand the quality of the investments that you've already got. So if you've got a return, split it up. Don't just think about total return. Have a look at the income and the growth of the investments. You'll find that the income has been quite good, and it will be quite good coming up. The distributions expect to be a very good year, and the growth might have a little bit more volatility in it. So just be mindful of that. The other thing is, don't react to risk by avoiding it and selling down. A lot of people do that. They get afraid. They jump out of the market. They sit on cash. Hopefully they'll jump back into the market when they feel that, the war is over or whatever happens. Unfortunately, what that does, that's a risk all on its own. You've jumped out of the market. You've paid costs to get out of the market. You're going to pay costs to get back into the market. You've missed distributions coming through, and you've also missed perhaps jumping into the market when the market's already started to rise. This can really hurt your portfolio.
Katrina, we know that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is having an impact, but what else is influencing the Australian stock market right at the moment?
Yeah, well, we've got a bit of a triple whammy going on. We've had the Queensland floods. Yes, we do have the Ukraine conflict, but also we've had the lingering effects of COVID coming through as well. So we've had quite a few things happen, and really our Australian economy has been quite resilient through all of that. We've had a surge in oil prices, which we've all seen when we go to the petrol station, and other commodities such as nickel and steel, nickel and metals have been going up. One of the other things is Russia actually supplies 25% of wheat to the world. So that's also going to have a bit of an effect on us. We're also being affected at the moment in Australia by, we're a net energy exporter, which is quite good. Europe and Japan particularly have been hurt because they're importers. So their markets are down about 20%. But overall, we are in a very good position at the moment, and very likely over a period of time to move towards fuel-efficient cars, which I know, Roy Sanderson, you've already done that.
Thanks, Katrina. What can we expect going forward, given all those influencing factors?
I think going forwards, we've seen that the last year, if we have a look at the Australian share market and the international market, the Australian share market last year did about 17.5%. The overseas market did about 25%. That's if you're in unhedged funds. Going forwards, the long-term view on the Australian market as we see it at the moment will be an average around about 10% per year, which is still very good. If you've structured your portfolio where you're receiving very good dividends, that will be more obtainable rather than taking on the risk without having distributions coming through. The Ukraine obviously is going to be a worry for everyone going forwards, but we can mitigate our risks once again, as I said, about having cash balances. The global growth is expected to be quite positive. We're going to have, not going to see these 20% returns that we've been seeing. We'll have a constrained view on the market. It will pull back, but we'll still be in positive territory. And we'll be seeing a lot more volatility coming through. So it's basically, put your seatbelt on and buckle it and stick on quality and stay there.
So Katrina, if I'm a retiree, and I'm not far from that, what should I be looking out for, or what should I be doing now?
Roy, I didn't think you were anywhere near that, by the way.
Thank you.
If you are a retiree, one of the key things is if you're in large funds, right now the superannuation funds are accumulating cash. They can get this through their contributions that are coming into the fund from members that are still working. If you've got your own funds, one of the things that you need to be aware of is make sure that you balance your fund properly and have that diversification. Make sure you've got enough cash to pay your pension payments. And this can be made up through distributions, or you might have to take some capital gains. Watch the balance of the structure of your assets. And this word diversification, it's more crucial now than it's ever been. We've been lovely having great returns going forwards in the past, but we really need to have a look at what we need in the home and make sure we've got enough of cash. Rule of thumb, if pre-retirement, have about 12 months worth of cash. If you retired, have about 2 years worth of cash you can lay your hands on. That way you'll relax, you'll be able to sleep well.
KP, always a pleasure having you on RJ Sanderson TV. Get the streamers and champagne ready for Roy's retirement party, and hopefully, though, there's a few more of these episodes but before that happens, and we'd love you to join again in the future.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
Katrina Poolbrook there, an executive planner with RJS. And Roy, we are back in 2022. It's been another big show. The budget's coming up next Tuesday, the 29th. And your man, Josh Frydenberg, part of the Carlton ecosystem with a big job in his hands. And the Blues with another big job, Hawks, they take on next Sunday. Could they go 3-0?
3-0. I don't know how long it is since we've done that, but I tell you walk a bit taller if you're a Carlton supporter at the moment.
Oh, you're walking tall at the moment. Thanks so much for joining us on RJ Sanderson TV. We will see you next month.